Hello students, welcome back to Civil Services Prime Time by CivicCentre IAS. In this video, we will discuss about international relations of last 1 week, and the topics of importance would be Ayni Air Base in Tajikistan. Why it was very important for India despite the negotiations between Russia and China in Tajikistan. And what are the topics that we are going to discuss in brief? The first one is UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, which is nothing but the climate change mitigation and adaptation. How the countries are evolving their climate change policies. So that we will discuss in great detail. Second one, Trump and Chinese President Xi Bonhomie. Nothing but in recent times, after USA has announced their sanctions and other penalties. Recently, these two countries, USA and China, has coming together, which was popularly known as G2 grouping. So what will be the impact on India? That we will discuss. Third one, India secures a 6 months US waiver for Chabahar port, which was present in Iran. So we are actively developing this Chabahar port to connect Middle East and Europe countries by bypassing Afghanistan, Pakistan. And this is not the first time that India has secured waiver. In earlier cases also, from USA, India has secured one-time waiver. This is the second time. Fourth one, Ayni Air Base in Tajikistan. That is nothing but your Central Asian region. So what is the significance of this Ayni Air Base? And last one would be Kunming Biodiversity Fund. Recently, 7 countries have received funds under this Biodiversity Fund. So what is this biodiversity all about? Whether it has come under UNFCCC or any other protocols. Let's try to decode one by one. So first one is UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. So nothing but with a report titled Running on Empty finds that a huge gap in adaptation finance for developing countries. So here you need to understand it very simple way. There are developed and developing nations. So what mostly developing nations are accusing, especially developed nation, is historically you are benefited. But right now, as per our economic growth and needs, you want us to make minimum for the economic growth. Nothing but you should limit your carbon footprints. In this way, the developed countries and developing countries are constantly arguing or fighting against the funds. So whenever you heard about anything conference of parties under UNFCCC, each country will host the UNFCCC year on year and they will create a dedicated fund. In the initial, the corpus fund will be provided by countries, like-minded countries. And what about the future of this fund? That no one knows. That is the biggest discussion related to your climate change finances. So everyone is talking about climate change mitigation and adaptation. No one is really serious about how funding will be done so that the developing countries and least developed countries will get their fair share of responsibility. That's why you have a word called common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR. So the climate change is common for each and everyone and each and every country. But responsibility should be differ because developed countries have higher finances, high technological knowledge. But what about the developing nations? Developing nations need to rise above all issues. So that's why if you look at any negotiations, especially WTO or UN, developed countries, let's say if they take 5 years, developing nations or underdeveloped countries, they will take 10 years to adjust the needs. So that is the UNEP. So what were the key findings of 2025? Massive finance gap, nothing but the rich countries and poor countries. The contribution to the dedicated fund from rich countries and poor countries are widened. Developing countries require at least 310 to 365 billion annually by 2035. For 2035, this much amount will be required. However, only $26 billion was mobilized in 2023 itself. So the expected value is 310 to 365 billion, but only $26 billion was mobilized in 2020, which is 12 to 14 times lower than the actual need. The climate finance, what we expecting for the 2035 and what we are gaining till 2023 has a stark difference. Second one, declining financial commitments. Adaptation finances fell from $28 billion in 2022 $26 billion. Obviously, the finances, especially from developed countries, have gradually fall down from $28 billion to $26 billion, which making it clear that Glasgow Climate Pact target of doubling adaptation finance by 2025 will not be met. Under Glasgow Climate Pact, UNFCCC, Glasgow Summit, popularly known as. So, what the world leaders have decided, at least we need to double the adaptation finance by 2025. So right now we are at the end of 2025 financial year, calendar year, sorry, not financial year. So for the funds what have been from 2023 to 22, it has been gradually declined. So obviously, so the target would not met in 2025 itself. Rising debt burden. Approximately 58% of adaptation finance is loan based, including non-concessional debt, exacerbating inequality and increasing debt vulnerability among developing nations. So what generally developing countries are expecting? Not loans, concessions, one-time grants. So these are generally expecting. But from different global financial institutions, these developing countries are taking loans for the climate change and mitigation. So obviously the debt profile of these nations or sovereign debt profile of these nations have gradually increased, which include whether it should be from loans or non-concessional debt. So you are not getting any concessions in the debt, which exacerbating inequality and increasing debt vulnerability, especially for the developing nations, because we are taking loans from advanced countries or developed countries or global financial institutions. So the debt profile have gradually increased. Uneven policy and planning process. Each and every country has its own and unique policies, whether it should be economic policies or environmental policies. Right? 172 countries have at least one national adaptation plan or framework. 36 plans are outdated, reducing effectiveness against escalating climate risks. So each and every country, each and every nation has its own national adaptation plan. Out of this, already 36 were outdated. They are not in line with the present conditions or needs of the environment. So obviously it will reduce the effectiveness against escalating climate risk. Implementation but limited impact. Globally, 1600 adaptation actions have been reported, mainly in biodiversity, agriculture, water and infrastructure, but few are evaluated for measurable outcomes or long-term resilience. So far, 1600 adaptation actions have been taken or reported, especially biodiversity, agriculture, water and infrastructure. But what about the feedback? Whether they have been measured or not, that no one knows mostly. Or whether these will give long-term resilience, that too we don't know. Weak private sector participation. Why private sector are very interested? If you ask a question, whether it should be green finances or climate change finances or in any economy, why private sectors will play a critical role? Because they are expecting returns or profits. If your projects or if your policies are not conducive for the private players, then obviously private players would not enter into these segments. Here also the weak private sector participation. Private sector investments remains low at around $5 billion annually. though potential exists to mobilize up to $50 billion through support policy mechanisms and blended finance models. Whether it should be triple P model or only private sector or joint ventures. Despite having these policies, support policy mechanisms, the private sector participation is very weak when it comes to climate change. So what is UNEP Adaptation Gap Report? It is nothing but annual flagship publication of UNEP. So these are very important from your prelims point of view. It assesses global progress in climate adaptation planning, implementation and financing. So here climate adaptation planning, how the countries are planning and how they are implementing and what are the different finance options available for these countries. The report is published by UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. So this is the responsible body which releases this report. What is the aim of this report? To evaluate how effectively countries, especially developing ones, here each and every adaptation or environment or climate change reports are mostly focusing on developing nations, are adapting to intensifying climate impacts. It also quantifies the adaptation finance gap and provide insights to guide global climate policy, investment and resilience building efforts. Here, UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, which also quantifies the adaptation finance gap, how to bridge the finance gap between developed countries and developing nations, and provide insight to global climate policy. What is the global climate policy? Investment, how to get investments in these climate change projects, and resilient building efforts for the coming future. So this is the UNEP.
Hello everyone. As you all know, Civil Services Prime Time is one of its kind initiative where we are teaching the students current affairs related to the particular subject one day at a time. అంటే ఒక వారంలో జరిగిన కరెంట్ అఫైర్స్ అన్ని ఒక సబ్జెక్ట్ కి సంబంధించి మేము ఒక రోజులో చెప్తున్నాం. సో దిస్ ఈజ్ ఆల్ బికాస్ ఆఫ్ ద రివర్స్ ఇంజనీరింగ్ టెక్నిక్. బికాస్ మీరు ప్రతి వీడియో చూసినట్టయితే ఎండ్ లో ప్రీవియస్ ఇయర్ క్వశ్చన్స్ ప్రిలిమ్స్ చేస్తున్నాము, అలాగే ఒక క్వశ్చన్ మెయిన్స్ చేస్తున్నాం. సో in order to get daily updates at 7 o'clock sharp as we are doing it, subscribe చేసుకోండి, అలాగే bell కూడా click చేయండి so that 7 o'clock కి మీకు immediate గా notification వస్తుంది.
So what are the limitations identified under UNEP? Severe funding deficit, obviously current finances, whatever the current finances that are available for the countries, barely 1/12 of the actual need. 1/12 of the actual need. Remaining 11th should be covered, creating a severe stress on developing nations' capacities. Only 1/12 of the actual need are covered, barely. Then what about remaining 11? That has to be taken care by the funds, dedicated funds. But if you are expecting it to be done from developing nations, they will have a severe stress on developing nations. Debt dominating finance. Loan heavy mechanisms risk pushing vulnerable nations into adaptation debt traps. So if you are keep expecting developing nations getting their finances own, obviously in the end they will fall into the debt traps, because these developing nations does not have sound finances to finance their climate change effects or climate change mitigation projects. So obviously you cannot expect everything from developing nation. Limited private participation. Absence of risk mitigation instruments hinder private sector engagement. So we are not providing any risk mitigation instruments to attract the private players. So obviously the private players are not in your game. Weak monitoring system. Many countries lack monitoring, evaluation and learning frameworks, hampering accountability and performance tracking. So this is not the problem in India, even in least developed countries. To some extent, the developed countries are also facing the same issue. So there is a dedicated fund. The fund will release the funds to certain programs. Where is the monitoring of the project? And what is the evaluation? How to evaluate the output of that projects? And if there are any issues, who will going to learn? So this is not only problem for developing nations, even to some extent developed countries are also facing this type of issues because of weak monitoring systems available in their countries. Risk of maladaptation. So let's suppose if you give a fund to any country under United Nations Environment Program, dedicated funds. Then let's suppose if these countries are isolated or poorly designed projects. So because they don't have anything knowledge on this climate change, let's suppose these countries are designed very poorly designed projects which will inadvertently heighten the climate vulnerabilities. Here these countries are not promoting climate mitigation or adaptation, rather than it will create climate vulnerabilities in the future. That is the biggest worry for any countries. What are the recommendations made in the report? Shift to grant based finances. You should not depend entirely upon loans from the developed countries or global financial institutions. Transition from loan to grant based or concessional funding to ensure equity in global climate finances, so that the developing countries especially does not fall under debt trap. Mobilize private sector investments. Encourage triple Ps, public-private partnerships, guarantees, and blended finance to unlock 50 billion annually for adaptation. This is one of the way to attract triple P. Integrate resilience into finance systems. Embedded climate resilience indicators into banking, insurance, and investment mechanisms to promote risk-informed decisions. In recent times, if you look at any investments, the bankings, especially under the RBI, have cautiously given loans. They are now calculating the climate change effects on your investments, whether it should in the manufacturing sector or agriculture sector. In a similar way, you can expect from insurance sector and other investment mechanisms to promote risk-informed decisions. Whatever the decisions that they have been taken, they have come up with a risks also that you should inform. In simple words, informed decision making. Update adaptation plans regularly. Ensure periodic revision of national adaptation plans to reflect updated scientific and socio-economic realities. Let's suppose if you adapt these plans in 2020, this is 2025. So the climate change and socio-economic vulnerabilities or realities have completely changed over the last 5 years. Obviously, you need to expect to be changed periodically this adaptation plan so that it can match the contemporary scenarios. Foster regional cooperation. Strengthen South-South partnership on technology transfers via platforms such as Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and International Solar Alliance. Here, mostly the countries who will under the climate change vulnerabilities are South countries. So South-South cooperation is very important. How can they will be cooperated? Obviously, there is CDRI and International Solar Alliance platforms are there. They can raise their voices against this climate change vulnerabilities and funding patterns or funding issues. So this will be recommendations. So that is the recommendations and United Nations Environment Program Adaptation Gap Report. Next, Trump Xi Bonhomie. Recently, Trump and Chinese president has met in Busan and revived the idea of G2 condominium. So here, from the perspective of USA, China and India. So USA has sanctioned tariffs, 50% tariffs from India. Whatever the exports from India will attract 50% transit. In initial days, the China government also attracts the more than 50, I think around 70%. But recently, US government has wavered below 50%. But Indian government does not get any concessions on their tariff plans. That's how USA and China has become against India's interest. Their tariff truce and rare earth cooperation suggest renewed US-China accommodation, a shift that could reshape India's strategic space and Quad's Indo-Pacific coherence. So if you observe the international relations, especially from last 5 to 6 years, there was an informal grouping, Quad, started by Japan during its tsunami in 2004, and later it was revised very recently, 2017. The purpose of this is Indo-Pacific region should be free from China. Chinese influence should not be there in Indo-Pacific region. whether it should be militarily, whether it should be economically, whether it should be culturally, because of the strategic significance of this Indo-Pacific region. But on contrary to this, the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, which has reshaped the India's strategic space. So what are the implications for India? Tariff disadvantage. India remains at the highest 50% slab post-Busan deal. So there was no discussion on India's tariff plan. US-China duties eased to 47%. US has reduced to 47%, which isolating India commercially. Commercially, India-USA rivalry was there. But USA-China rivalry has smoothed to some extent. Strategic marginalization. G2 talks risk sidelining India's balancing role. On each and every discussion, whenever Indo-Pacific region comes into the picture, USA or other European Union nations emphasize that India's role is very pivotal in Indo-Pacific. But this G2 grouping obviously sideline the India's balance role. G2 may carve Asia into competing influence zone because China and India are actively pursuing their manufacturing policies to become world's manufacturing hub. So obviously they will create a unnecessary competition between these two, because on one hand USA is supporting China, in the another perspective USA is supporting India. So there is a complementary rivalry between these two nations will carve into Asia and two separate global affairs. Bilateral US-China easing many may limit India's tech inflow. No relaxation in chip export controls for India. So obviously the technology access between USA and China may easing the limit India's tech inflow, because no relaxation is given for chip export controls for India. What were the implications for Quad? US-China truce may weaken Quad's security focus. The purpose of Quad was started for the against China, but it will weaken Quad security focus. US absence reduce collective coherence. Here, leadership uncertainty will be prevailed because US will absent. US will absence reduce the collective coherence. Trump prioritizing G2 over Quad meter signals downgrading of Quad. So obviously Donald Trump has prioritized the G2 groupings rather than focusing on Quad. The priority will be, Trump priorities will be Group 2. India, Japan and Australia may shoulder extra responsibility. So obviously USA is not taking care of Indo-Pacific policies. Then obviously the remaining three countries, India, Japan and Australia, may shoulder extra responsibility to revive or to continue Quad grouping. So that is the G2 grouping that was recently seen in news. India secures 6 months US waiver for Chabahar port, which was located beside to it. Gwadar port was there, which was developed by China under China-Pakistan economic corridor. Why it was in news? Because India has received 6 months waiver from US sanctions on Iran's Chabahar port, allowing continued Indian operations there until April 2026. For the upcoming year 2026 April, US cannot give any sanctions, lap any sanctions on India's operations in Iran's Chabahar port. So what are the key features of the port? Location and geography. If you look at Chabahar port is situated in Iran's Sistan Baluchistan province. These are very important. And the Gulf of Oman near the mouth of Strait of Hormuz. These water bodies these were very important for your prelims point of view. The Chabahar port comprises two ports mostly, Shahid Kalantari, Shahid Beheshti. So mostly you might heard this Shahid Beheshti port, but you did not know this Shahid Kalantari. Sometimes questions might be picked in a way. Shahid Kalantari recently seen in news, which belongs to which country's port. It is Iran's only oceanic and deep water port giving direct access to Indian Ocean. That is the strategic advantage for Indian Ocean. The Chabahar port is located 170 kilometers west of Pakistan Gwadar port, which is being developed by China under China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Strategic and economic importance for India. Chabahar port provides direct access to Afghanistan and Central Asia bypassing Pakistan. Here the country which you should not easily trusted is Pakistan. Obviously, to bypass Pakistan, this Chabahar port plays an important role. It forms the International North-South Transport Corridor (INSTC), which linking India with Iran, Caspian Sea, Russia, Europe, and strengthen India's maritime connectivity and energy security in the Indian Ocean. Do let me know in the comment section what is the major difference between INSTC and India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So what is the major difference between these two groupings? Chabahar port act as a counterbalance to China's Belt and Road Initiative and Pakistan's Gwadar port under China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Under the nexus of China and Pakistan's love, Gwadar port was developed by Chinese government. So to counter Chinese influence in this region especially, Indian government has come up with a Chabahar port with an active participation from Iran. It serves as a linchpin of India's Connect Central Asia and extended neighborhood policies to support our neighborhoods policies and at the same time to support Central Asia or to connect the Central Asia. It is one of the major port available for the India. India-Iran cooperation. India entered into agreement in 2005 with Iran to develop the port. India and Iran signed in 2015 to develop a Shahid Beheshti terminal at Chabahar, which India formally took over in 2018 through India Ports Global Private Limited. So with this special purpose vehicle, India has developing this port or Beheshti terminal at Chabahar and formally took over in 2018. In 2016, a trilateral agreement was signed between India, Iran and Afghanistan to establish an international transport and transit corridor through Chabahar port. So these are very important, the agreements. So US sanctions and waivers. In 2018, US granted India waiver for Chabahar. This is the first time that India has received a waiver, recognizing its role in supporting Afghanistan's development. So far, the US forces which were present in Afghanistan did not left from Afghanistan. That's why, that might be one of the reason why USA has given waiver for Chabahar for the Afghanistan's development. Later, the waiver was revoked in 2025, making an entity linked with Chabahar liable to penalties under Iran Freedom and Counter-Proliferation Act under 2012. The 6 months US sanction waiver, October 2025 to April 2026, allows uninterrupted Indian operations at the port. So as early, as much as possible, Indian entities should complete their port works in Chabahar. After that, there is no waiver as of now, the discussions. Current status. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan has expressed interest in using Chabahar for trade, recognizing its importance. Efforts are ongoing to integrate Chabahar with INSTC and proposed Chabahar-Zahedan-Mahadam rail link, Iranian railways, with Iranian railways, so that Iran government is also actively promoting their economic growth. The port continues to serve as a strategic node for India's westward outreach despite geopolitical shifts. Even though the geopolitical shifts are changing frequently, India's westward outreach to this strategic node is very important. That is the discussion for Chabahar port extension. India Ayni Air Base in Tajikistan. Why it was in news? Because from 2022 after, from Tajikistan, the government of Tajikistan did not approve extension. Some might be pressures from Russia and China. If you look at countries in the Middle East nations, Tajikistan, this is the country, this is the Dushanbe. So what is air base in Tajikistan? Ayni Air Base. It is also known as Gizar Military Aerodrome, which is strategically located air base in Tajikistan that India helped develop and operate jointly with the Tajik government since 2002. Since from 2002, with the active participation of India, the Tajikistan government, it has developed a air base for its strategic significance. It was India's first overseas military facility, giving its strategic presence in Central Asia. And it is also one of the important fact. This is the first overseas military facility developed by India in Central Asian region. The base lies just west of Dushanbe, Tajikistan capital, nothing but around 20 kilometers from the Afghans' Wakhan corridor, which borders Pakistan occupied Kashmir and China. So this is where the story gets interesting. To counter the influence of both Pakistan and China, this air base plays a strategic significance for Indians. Originally built during Soviet era USSR, during USSR regime, the base fell into disuse after USSR collapse. In 1990s to 1993, the USSR completely disintegrated. After disintegration, the base was not utilized. India redeveloped it in 2001 and 2 with a key roles played by NSA Ajit Doval, Air Chief Marshal B.S. Dhanova and Border Roads Organizations, BRO, which works under Ministry of Defense. Funded by the Ministry of External Affairs, obviously you can expect, so whenever any projects that have to be developed in another nations, Ministry of External Affairs projects will be there, and sometimes Exim Bank also plays an important role. India spent about $100 million extending the runway to 3,200 meters, building hangars, refueling facilities and maintenance units across the line. The base was occasionally used by Indian Air Force for humanitarian evacuation missions. Whenever any conflicts are arising in this region, especially Central Asian or Middle East, so obviously the Indian Air Force will be utilized this air base for the evacuation missions, including Afghanistan crisis in 2021. So what is the strategic importance? India's military foothold in Central Asia. Obviously, India has an edge over Central Asia, a region of high strategic interest for not only India, even China, Russia and USA also. Enable surveillance and operational reach over Afghanistan, Pakistan. So whatever the activities, especially under the borders, that will be surveillance and operational reach will be easy for Indian Air Force or Indian staff who are there at Indian Air Base. Located near the Wakhan corridor, it is offered Indian leverage in regional security and counter-terrorism operations from the Wakhan corridor perspective, which strengthened India's role as a security partner in Central Asia amid growing Chinese proximity. So if you look at the Chinese Pakistan proximity, under Belt and Road Initiative, under CPEC, the proximity between these two countries have very much closed. Obviously, to counter this, you need a security partner in Central Asia. That's why this base was developed. What is the current status? The lease expires in 2021. The Tajikistan declined renewal under Russian and Chinese influence because Russian forces reportedly took over the operations at the base from 2022 or by early 2023. The base is no longer Indian operated. Here, India is no longer operating this air base. India continues to maintain diplomatic and security engagement in Central Asia with the numbers, with the countries actively around these nations. That is the Ayni Air Base. Last one, Kunming Biodiversity Fund. In October 2025, 7 countries, Cook Islands, Madagascar, Mexico, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Turkey and Uganda, secured a $5.8 million in grants. So, in grant means these are not loans. You should not repay them. Repay is not an obligation under grants from the Kunming Biodiversity Fund to promote nature-friendly agriculture. Mostly they are focusing on agriculture. It is a multi-partner trust fund launched in 2021 during the part 1 of Conference of Parties. COP is nothing but Conference of Parties 15 of Convention of Biological Diversity, CBD. It aims to facilitate the successful implementation of Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework at regional, national and subnational and local level. So to implement this KMGBF at regional, national and subnational and local level, the dedicated fund, multi-partner trust fund, multiple countries are involving in this funding. Initial contribution 1.5 billion yuan, not US dollars. If you convert into the US dollars, it is $200 billion from China. It was established under the leadership of Ministry of Environment and Ecology of China and United Nations Environment Program, Secretariat of the Convention of the Biological Diversity and United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So these were the bodies involving in this fund. So what was the focus area of this fund? Especially it supports developing countries. In earlier topics also we have discussed about. Whenever any fund is in news, majority of the cases developing nations or least developed countries will comes into the picture. So in a similar way, it also supports developing countries to accelerate and upscale their actions for the national biodiversity strategies and action plans of each and every countries. So here they want to protect their biodiversity and at the same time agriculture. What is Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity? It was adopted during 15th meeting of COP in December 22. COP is nothing but highest decision making body under United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. It aims to support the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So what was the purpose of this framework? To achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Right? And build on previous strategic plans. So, but the problem with this Sustainable Development Goals is, these are not legally binding. So if any country is not doing anything about their sustainable development practices, there is no penalty for that countries. So that's why sometimes sustainable development goals are also under the question mark. Before this, Millennium Development Goals were proposed by United Nations. These are also non-binding and non-legally binding in nature. Then what is the purpose of SDGs if you are not legally binding them? It sets bold path towards global harmony with nature by 2050. The GBF consists 23 targets set for 2030. Just like how United Nations has created sustainable development goals, this GBF set for 2030, 23 targets they have been taken. And 4 global goals set for 2050. To preserve biodiversity for current and future generations. Nothing but sustainable development practices. What is sustainable development practices according to Brundtland Commission? You can utilize the resources now and at the same time you can left some resources for the future generations. That is the sustainable development practice. So that is the simple discussions related to these topics that we have been discussing for this week IR topics. So if you feel these topics are found helpful in any way for your preparation, please do mention in comment section, and at the same time the friends and fellow aspirants that you might know in this preparation, you can share this video to them also, so that they will also get some benefits. That is the discussion for international relations current affairs of this week, which is by Civil Services Prime Time under CivicCentre IAS. Thank you for watching class. Have a nice day.
CivicCentre IAS is offering Telangana Group 1 Prelims cum Mains classes as well as Andhra Pradesh Group 1 Prelims cum Mains classes in English medium for a period of 8 to 10 months. This also covers the complete NCERT textbooks and statewide textbooks. So what are you waiting for? Learn through reverse engineering technique today. Admissions are in progress. Join now. Visit our website. Thank you.